Okay, so good morning, everyone. Dear distinguished guests, esteemed scholars, colleagues, good morning again. It is such a pleasure to have you here today. I'm Ambrozaite, co-director of the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub, the host of the Science Diplomacy Summit. And I would like to start, first of all, by extending a really, really warm welcome to the inaugural Science Diplomacy Summit that's taking place in our inaugural, and really esteemed institution, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center in the very heart of Washington, D.C. So the Science Diplomacy Summit that we have here for today and tomorrow started as an idea, as all big things start with an idea. And that happened when Professor Peter Agre and I launched the Science Diplomacy Hub last September of 2023. So what's the idea? Why do we do what we do? The mission of the Science Diplomacy Hub and the Science Diplomacy Summit overall is to convene individuals from all the different sectors and all the different countries, like you today, to really convene, and have these unexpected dialogues, these cross-pollination of ideas, and really connect and bridge the worlds of science and diplomacy. And I hope that you'll be able to do that over the next 2 days when we have more than 700 of you here at the summit, coming from all different parts of the world. So it is crucial to have such an event as the Science Diplomacy Summit, where we connect the evidence-based research with policy development, And that's exactly what our university aims to do as well, with the very strong One University vision, which emphasizes heavily the importance of creating and cultivating this interdisciplinary partnership, collaboration, scholarship, and research. So the amount of excitement and just interest in such a new field as science diplomacy has been truly overwhelming and in a good way. And to think that we started what we do, the science diplomacy convenings, only a few months ago, really. So I think it shows that we are doing something right. So the Science Diplomacy Summit is offering a menu, a really diverse menu of science diplomacy options, So we have more than 20 different countries represented, and over the next 2 days, you'll be able to listen to more than 40 different thematic science diplomacy sessions, focusing on topics such as artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, climate change innovation, health, space and oceans, international partnerships, and much more. The major theme that's driving the summit is also the understanding that beyond discourse, beyond talking, we also need to take really concrete action. And with that in mind, we really want to invite you to connect and chat with the individuals who are nearby, maybe sitting right next to you right now, and establish these partnerships. And that's what we've seen happen actually a lot of times during our own events throughout the past few months, and really transcend any kind of geographical, sectoral, or other types of flavors, boundaries that might exist out there. So today we have the honor of hosting Congressman Bill Foster as our keynote speaker, who will have the fireside chat with our university president, Ron Daniels, after the keynote address that you will hear shortly. And then before I conclude, I'll be brief, I would like to extend our heartfelt, really, appreciation to the other two key organizing committee members, and Claire Chen is standing right here. So Claire Chen is the senior executive on Incura Global Initiatives, and then we have Franklin Carrero Martinez, who is the Senior Director of Global Sustainability and Development and Science and Technology for Sustainability at the National Academy of Sciences. Really, their passion, dedication to building bridges and making this happen, that was instrumental to really making sure that we can execute the science diplomacy in the way that we do. So, we are launching the summit today. We're very excited. I hope you can tell that we're very much looking forward to having you here. And we look forward to building this impactful platform to see many more of these sustainable science diplomacy partnerships for the years to come. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I would like to give the floor, the stage, to the person who has been leading the Science Diplomacy Hub with me since day zero, and that is Professor Peter Agre, 2003 Nobel Laureate in Chemistry, and the individual who has showcased the power that a scientist can have in the field of diplomacy. Thank you.
Good morning. I'll be very brief. The Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Group is a group run by students and postdoctoral fellows. These are young scientists. My role in this is to cheer them on and to help steer some of the finances. This has been funded by a generous grant, Nexus grant from the Provost Office and the leadership of Johns Hopkins. And I feel very wonderful opportunity for all of us to use science for another dimension. My mother was a farm girl. She never went to college. But when I got the call from Stockholm 20 years ago that I would share the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, I was advised by the committee to get ready for the day, so I was having a shower. My wife, Mary, called my mother back in Minnesota. She was in a retirement home, explaining that I would share the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Her words were, after a short pause, "Tell him not to let it go to his head. We're still waiting for him to do something useful." And I think that's where science has uses that are not commonly thought of as the primary mission of science. But certainly the work I've done in Africa with the Johns Hopkins Malaria Research Institute over the last 16 years, meeting with the ministries of health, malaria control agencies in Zimbabwe, Congo, Zambia, as well as the work with the AAAS, the Office for Science Diplomacy. We were just in Cuba 2 months back. Keith Yamamoto was with us, president of the AAAS. So we should use these opportunities, and I hope to use the next couple of days to meet new people, learn new ideas, and see the value of science. Thank you for attending this. We hope you enjoy it.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter, for that kickoff. And now we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Congressman Bill Foster, who is a scientist and businessman representing the 11th Congressional District of Illinois, a position he has held since 2013. He also represented the 14th Congressional District of Illinois from 2008 till 2011. He is the only PhD physicist in Congress. Bill serves on the House Financial Services Committee and is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy. Bill was also recently named to the Bipartisan House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all. And, you know, it's always an adventure for my staff when they write me prepared remarks and then and then get me in front of a group of even partly scientists here and to see how far I stray off script. I'm Congressman Bill Foster. I sometimes introduce myself as saying I represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the United States Congress. And this is, you know, I'm also a businessman, which is a very important thing. And I'd like to get to the questions as soon as possible, but the two main themes that I thought are worth emphasizing here is the increased rate and the speed of progress of scientific knowledge and the much larger number of people that are doing research. You know, if you think back at, I guess, America's first scientist diplomat was Benjamin Franklin, who's, you know, did minor things like discovering there were two forms of electric charge, which he did, of course, by looking at the equations for the scalar field and so on, or by rubbing stuff together to figure out, you know, that there were two flavors of electric charge. But there were, I don't know, maybe 1,000 real practicing scientists at that point, and now there are, you know, probably millions. And we're about to be joined by probably tens of millions of robots doing automated experiments that used to be done by grad students and postdocs. Things like giant factories for drug discovery, just doing all the experiments robotically. And so the rate of progress will continue to increase exponentially without even getting to artificial intelligence. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be struggling with, is it's just, you know, it's not going to slow down. I remember the feeling when I was in grade school when I first looked at the little tiny library in our school library and realized that I would not be able to read every book that's ever been published, and I was crushed. And when you just look at, there was also a moment when I realized that I could no longer really read every single month's physical review letters. And he said, oh, you know, and the onslaught of technical information is one of the challenges. I think, well, as well as the entire internet, I think that the only realistic solution we're going to get to that is to have an AI standing between us and everything that's out on the internet. And it's really important that that AI be on your side. If the AI that's between you and the internet is the Google search engine AI, they don't work for you, they work for the advertisers on Google. And that's going to be the challenge, is to align the interests of the AI that we're going to need to filter information from us, from our personal interest and the interests of humanity as a whole. And that is I think that's going to be the challenge for the next decade. Assuming, there's also this ongoing debate about whether we're more likely to be wiped out by carbon-based life forms or silicon-based life forms. And I have to say, with COVID, it appeared as though, carbon-based life forms got out to an early lead, but AI is coming, making a strong push on the outside. So that's one of the things, is just the increased rate of change. The other thing is the dual use nature of the technologies. Essentially everything you can point to is dual use almost immediately. Even something that seems theoretical like quantum will immediately be used to break cryptography. And it didn't used to be that way. There's a famous instance. I worked at Fermi National Labs for 20 years. The founding director of Fermi Lab was a guy called Bob Wilson, who worked for the Manhattan Project, and at the end of the war, he just turned his security clearance in and never touched it again. And at one point, when he was building Fermilab, which was $500 million back in the early 1960s, which was $500 million, which was a lot of money back then. And so he got hauled in front of a Senate committee. And the senator said, okay, we're giving you all this money to do scientific research. And, these guys didn't know the difference between a nuclear reactor and a particle accelerator. So he had to deal with that. And the senator said, look, we're giving you all of this money. Tell me what this has to do with the national defense. And his answer was sort of famous, at least among high-energy physicists. And he said, it has absolutely nothing to do with national defense. And the senator said, what do you mean it has nothing to do with national defense? He says, absolutely nothing to do with national defense, except perhaps to make the country more worth defending. And that used to be the right answer. But back in the 1990s, I guess, I first started, along with other people at Fermilab, we're using neural networks to analyze the debris that came off particle physics interactions and collisions. And we used to have these screaming fights with each other about whether you could really publish anything based on a neural net. This is now called the explainability problem in AI. If you publish a paper that says we have discovered a new particle because our neural network says so, that's not an acceptable answer. How do you actually even read a paper like that? And the same thing happens now. In the last session of Congress, I was chairing the subcommittee on AI and financial services. And then if someone says, your mortgage has been turned down because our neural network says so, that's not really an acceptable answer, especially when you can have all the same kinds of biases that humans have. So there's a huge set of problems there too, that we're so close to relevant. You're just playing around with drone programming and a bunch of students, and then all of a sudden it becomes the most important technology in war. You're messing around with studies of viruses, and then all of a sudden, it could be a huge problem for mankind. There's even protein synthesis. There's a recent letter. I've now backed off to. I make my best efforts to read Science magazine with less than a 1-month delay, and that's how far my ability to process scientific information has gone. And there was a very good letter to the editor about the intersection from George Church and David Baker on the problem with AI and protein synthesizers, or these desktop DNA synthesizers is the most frightening thing. And so we're going to be in a situation where thousands of grad students and postdocs have on their desk the ability to operate a DNA synthesizer that will allow them, if they choose, to recreate smallpox. And so that trying to figure out what sort of protections we can tolerate, we should encourage, and what we can tolerate to not slow down scientific progress. It's going to be one of the huge challenges. The debate between open science and closed science, and open source software for AI and closed source software. So no shortage of things to worry about in this area. And I think with that, I'll just switch over to our fireside chat and start answering questions. Thank you.
Well, good morning, all. I'm Ron Daniels, and it's my great privilege to be the president of Johns Hopkins University and to be here today at this really important convening. And Congressman, thank you for your provocative and insightful set of remarks to get us going. To Ona and Peter, you guys are terrific. On relatively short notice, what you've been able to pull together is really something. And again, Peter, so many ways, and you've made amazing contributions to science and, of course, to our university. Yet one more that you've done here. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your leadership. So, Congressman, I want to start off and maybe just do a little bit of basics before we explore some of these issues around the challenges with respect to regulation of some of these technologies, and in particular, how we do this on a global basis. So to start, when we think about, and of course, it's great that we now have the Science Diplomacy Hub at Johns Hopkins University, but when we think about the prospects of science diplomacy, it seems to me, at least historically, we see this as an opportunity to promote international comedy, to build bridges across different countries, to advance science, particularly to build bridges with adversaries, and to be in that domain where we're able to do things that are not easily accomplished through other mechanisms, and sometimes through other citizen-to-citizen mechanisms. There's something special about science. And so if we start there, when you look back over the last half to full century, what do you see as the most significant achievements for science diplomacy in terms of realizing these ideals?
Well, I put at the top of that list just the generations of students that have gone and done advanced degrees in other countries, that those connections are, just incredibly important. Many of them have gone on to senior positions in different countries around the world, people that got advanced educations in Europe or the U.S. And I think it's been a very effective way of moving the values of the free world and making them more universal than they otherwise would have been. The scientific collaboration is easier because there you start out with a shared common ground of verifiable scientific fact. Whereas in diplomacy, the reality is what people believe it is, or in the law to a large extent. And that's a big difference. A lot of what tears the world apart even today are things that you cannot quantify, and non-scientific things that have a very deep connection to us as human beings, but are not always productive in keeping the world peaceful. And so this is, that was always why it was easiest to start with the scientists. That very often the scientists can get along even when the politicians or even the public in different countries cannot. That's changed a little bit. I mean, it used to be that when we had Russian collaborators, which we did from the very start of the existence of the laboratory. I think the first experiment that was ever done at Fermi National Lab had Russian collaborators on it. And when the Russian team always had the guy that wasn't that good a physicist that you kind of knew was the KGB guy, and that was, but it was okay because you could still go out and get drunk and have real conversations with them. Well, you couldn't really compete with the Russians in drinking, but aside from that, it worked. It has become much harder now because of social media. When students from different countries come to get education in the West, and I guess the prototypical example is a Chinese student coming to the West these days. There's a problem that they're connected to and being spied on via their social media. And so that they continue to exist in a little information bubble that can be controlled remotely and monitored remotely. And that's a big difference. And so that's one of the challenges. I think it was extremely effective following World War II. We had this choice: should we repeat the mistakes of World War I, or should we, support organizations like CERN and everything that we did to open up United States science to the countries that were our opponents in World War II. And that works spectacularly well. That if you look at countries like Japan and Korea that had no history at all of having any democracy or even the rule of law, it changed. And those countries, as they opened up, as they got more prosperous, and we developed this narrative that maybe that's a natural state of affairs, that a country gets a little bit wealthy, and if they're stable long enough, then universal values will naturally emerge. I think and China started down that road and took a few steps down and then made a U-turn and is now going back. And that is the major challenge facing science. I don't think that you hear politicians screaming that, oh my gosh, the Italian scientists are learning everything that we've at our cutting edge. That's not the problem. The problem is other countries that don't share our values, as well as the dual use nature of everything these days.
So I want to pick up on this dual use issue and just the broader change in the climate, and even to the extent to which you have this firsthand experience at Fermi and dealing with Russia, the Soviet Union, a different kind of environment in which this science diplomacy enterprise was able to take place. So we look at now, first and foremost, what's really striking to me is the extent to which we have got a new geopolitical rival in China, which isn't just scientifically formidable, but economically formidable. And as we think about that relationship and its risks, it's very much viewed through the prism of economic competitiveness. We're worried that they're going to steal a march on us, whether it's AI, whether it's various types of innovations in the biomedical space. One can manufacture the number of areas in which we see this as a rivalrous country. And it's in that context that we go back to the scope for science diplomacy. And the concern, of course, is that because of the dual nature of scientific research, that relatively what we would have thought in the past are just this is basic scientific ideas, insights that we're sharing, now have the capacity to be used to advance economic interests. So in that context, we see it very directly in the university. More and more, the capacity to collaborate with colleagues in China is really being restricted. The scope for free movement of scientists, of sharing of ideas, of participation in talent programs on both sides is now seen to be at risk. So I'm wondering whether has science changed, or is it basically that our view of the relationship with China and the extent to which we're so concerned that even in areas like climate change or biomedical innovation, that we can't collaborate because this kind of scientific research will give them a leg up and therefore is threatening to us?
Yeah, one of the tragedies here is a lot easier to destroy trust than to build it up. And there are a few very high-profile instances where there was strategic theft of intellectual property, maybe many. And so that causes all countries and all companies and all universities and to go on high alert over this. One of the leading lights of Google AI research, recently defected back to China. And he had been an award winner inside Google, but he took with him all of the designs for all of Google's high-end AI chips, which he had downloaded to his private devices before he left. And so this is a massive breach of trust. This is billions of dollars of investment that Google put in that is now all in the hands of someone in China. And so this is, it's not a small problem. There was this discussion happened, back in the 1980s when you had the Japan that could say no, and everyone was projecting that Japan would take over the world. I'm a little distressed with the fact that there appears to be in Washington D.C. a number of politicians that are making their careers out of trying to build China up to being 10 feet tall. the economic growth is investment times return on investment. And the Chinese government, because it's politically allocated capital, have a very wide spread in the return on their investments. The things like all of the Belt and Road initiatives, those loans are never going to be paid back. And I don't even think they're going to be politically that useful for China. On the other hand, they have invested a huge amount in educating a massive number of engineers and scientists. And that is something that should, if the rest of the economy works well, have a massive return on investment. And then there's, all of the robots coming to take all of our jobs. And whether, as the economy is just completely turned upside down in the next decade, with the sort of, the fact that for most of human labor is going to have its market value pushed down towards zero. And that is going to, because, of the huge advantages of being able to deploy multiple copies of one AI program to do the same job over and over. And the advances toward more general purpose robotics and so on, where you just describe in words, hey, this is the job I want done, and then do it, and it will work 24 hours a day, never go on strike, and break down a lot less frequently than people. And so that there was going to be a huge displacement that is going to happen. And the free market will naturally allocate all of the wealth to it's an old science fiction plot about the owner of the factory that builds the robots that build more robots that just take over the economy. It's what I guess Sam Altman calls the future light cone of all of all revenue. To the first entity that comes up with a general purpose AI that can design much better AIs, and there's a lot of real worries there, and so that may end up mattering more than the details of international collaboration. It is who gets there first.
Or, well, again, I'd like to think about, when we think about what is in the realm of science diplomacy, it seems from what you're saying, there's real urgency about thinking about how you actually can imagine global regulation of these technologies, how we can build trust across rivals to be able to essentially get the benefits of these technologies without the dark side that you're depicting here. So how do you think about, what the path, particularly in a setting which you live with daily in Congress, but particularly in a setting of deep distrust, skepticism, how do we actually imagine that we're going to be able to sit across the table and get some international rules of the road so that we actually can properly regulate these technologies? Or is this quixotic? And in the end of the day, the game is you better get there first and not let them get a leg up on you.
Yeah, that was sort of the model of the Manhattan Project. Which was probably a correct decision at that time, despite the huge downturn. And I think there's at least a 50% chance that that's the right model here. I am encouraged that among countries that at this point share Western values, that's not going to be the problem. That if it turns out the Japanese get there first, or the Koreans, or the Australians, or the Canadians get there first, we're all going to be okay in the West. That there is, a feeling that ultimately, democracy should be in control, and as long as we can avoid the business of democracy being hacked by social media. And the fact that if you have one AI that's standing between you and the internet, and then that AI is filtering you one version of reality that doesn't comport with what is maybe in your long-term best interest, then that is that's a big problem. And the governance there is, I think, the toughest one. Is that who gets to say, I'm sorry, you're living in a little filter bubble, and we are going to pierce that bubble, or we are going to say, the model that we've always had is that there's human agency and that maximum freedom works, and that was under the assumption that individuals can process all of the relevant information, and there's such an information overload going right now that I get. Just one example, I have people come into my office saying that quantum supremacy is going to be here in 3 years. Other people say it's going to be 40. And these are practitioners that are very close to the state of the art, and it matters a lot. Because if all of our cryptography is going to be broken in 3 years, we better get moving to fix it proactively.
I want to go back to the example that you provided of the defection from Google and taking proprietary information from them. And I think that's, again, we see that as a relatively easy case and a straight-out breach of intellectual property rules. This is not about being engaged in a collaborative enterprise across rivalrous nations and basic research. It's just taking and unlawful taking at that. But I want to go back to if you put that scenario aside and thinking about what are the things that you think as we look to, again, dealing with, it's not, as you say, it's not difficult when we're dealing with the Western alliance. It gets much more complicated when we think about China, when we think about Russia, when we think about Iran. What would you say now are the areas, the subjects, the projects that we could actually imagine investing in with those rivals? And do so, again, in a way in which, to your dual use point, how do we deal with the prospect that even this collaboration might end up giving advantage to rivals on the economic competitiveness domain?
Well, I think, one of the clear examples are pandemic preparedness. I was just, there are many lessons to be learned, and it's, one of the tragedies of democracy is that our attention span never exceeds the next election, and so that it's already fading in the rearview mirror. But there's a lot of damage done to the reputation of science by the fact that scientific advice during COVID was changing and changing and changing. And there was a lot of uncertainty that was very hard to transmit to people. You remember when we were all sterilizing our groceries and stuff like that? And that was nonsense. I think that one of the things that I personally like to do, and one of the things I haven't given up on, is to understand that at times of pandemic, there's a special need, an extreme need for verifiable, explainable scientific truth. One example of that is that there were discussions from the very earliest days of let us do what are called human challenge trials. These are experiments when you deliberately infect humans to answer scientific questions. For example, what is the spreading mechanism? Is it all about eating the virus, or is it inhaling? And what exactly? Little tiny numbers of viruses or great big blobs? I don't think we still have clear scientific reading of that. It would be very easy to, design experiments to do that. But we didn't have in place the international and national sort of ethical framework to make that happen. So much of the pain we went through, and so much of the drop in the prestige of science came about because we simply didn't know the answers, and people were demanding absolute scientific truth. They would say, I'm not going to take the vaccine until you can prove it's absolutely true, and then you'd be sitting there talking about statistics to them, and that was tough. You'd say, I have this great idea of hydroxychloroquine. It's not stupid, it might have worked, it would have been great, but the way to test that is the way we would test it on primates, which is to deliberately infect, make a placebo-controlled experiment. I was talking to all of the mRNA vaccine makers from the very earliest times. So the moment, essentially, that they had successful results on primates, they said, okay, it is very likely this is going to be a home run for people. But it was, 8 or 10 months later before we unblinded huge sort of parasitic clinical trials, not really clinical trials, just, tests of it on large populations. We could have known just a few weeks later in a way that would have, if we would have said, okay, we're going to take 100 volunteers, give half of them a placebo, infect all of them. And, with young, healthy people, probably no one would have died in retrospect. And so this would have been a huge lesson to the public about the scientific method. And it would have made it very easy to explain to the public that, okay, here is why hydroxychloroquine is crap, and here is why these vaccines are X% effective on this particular population. And so I think, so we have to have on standby for pandemic preparedness, I believe, the ability to rapidly deploy the science in explainable ways, like human challenge trials. And unfortunately, what we did then is we convened a bunch of doctors, and they said, oh, the Hippocratic Oath says do no harm to any patient. Okay, that's not the right model in a pandemic. In a pandemic, it's much more like, well, all right, we've got this invader coming in, and I'm calling for volunteers for a small team to go out and see how the enemy operates. And it's not, we don't know the risks of going and spying on the enemy, but if we find out the answer, we're going to save millions of lives. And so that, that is something where I think we just didn't have the moral framework in place. And that was it's an example of where getting the scientific method ready to go in places when it's valuable is going to be really important.
Do you worry? I mean, it sounds right. You want to have better capacity to interrogate, ultimately to adjudicate these scientific claims, and then be able to transmit them with some kind of clarity, accessibility to the public at large. It sounds like a good institution to create. We got a lot of those around, though, currently in the United States and indeed internationally. Ultimately, does that still bump up against the reality of social media, a highly polarized political environment, that even creating or strengthening, seeking to strengthen these institutions, that ultimately is going to meet the blogosphere and the extent to which this effort will be ultimately criticized, demonized, and seen to be handmade into some other agenda?
Yeah. It's tough because there's a difference in the way you run society when it's on a wartime footing than on a peacetime footing. In a peacetime footing, it's the old Winston Churchill thing about having to do with the spread of lies. And so this is, we actually have to we have to think more clearly as a species about this, is that when, are we in a true emergency situation, or is this something where the best model is to just let a million flowers bloom and let the debate, the debate proceed, let everyone speak, let everyone listen. And that's about to get infinitely harder because we're about to be just inundated with AI-generated crap. And this is not going to help the situation at all.
So I'm here in Washington for a few days at the American Association of Universities semi-annual meeting, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of glum-looking presidents who saw what happened to the NSF this year in terms of its allocation, and so I can't help but ask you, to the extent that we're thinking about the prospects of science diplomacy, ultimately, all these endeavors still require a fundamental investment by the federal government in core science, and this wasn't a good moment for us. So how do you think about how you're doing in making the case to your colleagues about why this is really essential for America and for beyond?
Yeah, look, you touched on a raw nerve there because, I was on the conference committee with the CHIPS and Science Act. The initial concept was that we were going to double the science budgets over a decade. And they said, oh, this is great. And then a bunch of senators mostly said, oh, great, since we're doubling the budget, why don't we steer a lot of the money into my own pet projects, do a lot of technology transfer, do a lot of, bypassing of the traditional merit-based peer-reviewed system. And so I had been on high alert along with some other members of Congress about the dangers there that this might end up, if we in fact did not double the scientific budget, that this would proceed to use the traditional, merit-based, peer-reviewed program as a piggy bank for all these new pet projects, which is precisely what's happened. So we've got protective languages in there that said all of these new projects will not happen unless we're on a trajectory to double the budget. That language was put into the Senate version and into the House version, and then in the middle of the night, right before the text was finalized, it was stripped out. All right, and so this is a source of ongoing frustration. To this day, I've not been able to figure out who it was that did that. It was, I presume, an appropriations staffer, because we have this funny structure in the United States where you have authorizing and then appropriating, and the appropriations actually adjust the amount of money, and so that, and I think there's a cultural difference in what happens on the authorizing committees. I was on the science committee at the time, last session of Congress, and so we naturally take a 10-year view of science, because every 10 years we come and say, okay, let's sort of re-steer the whole enterprise. Whereas the appropriations are all about every single year they figure out which goodies to hand out. And so they have a very different mindset. And so that causes us to systematically underinvest in long-term things. Because that's the focus of the authorizers and not the appropriators. And so I think it's actually one of the real weaknesses of democracy because of the short-term planning horizon. It's very much like the CEOs of big publicly held companies. They're all about the bonuses they'll get by this quarter's profit. And so that's where they focus their attention rather than where the stock price will be 20 years from now. And so we do a lot in the Financial Services Committee is trying to shift the incentive packages for the people steering our economy to a longer term, because that does a lot of damage. And one of the, it causes us to underinvest in education, things like early childhood education particularly, but also in scientific research.
Can you say something about the Science Technology Advisory Board that you're involved in establishing, just the extent to which some of these short-term problems, that kind of myopia that policy and investment strategy suffers from, to what extent do you see this as being an effective mechanism to ameliorate that?
It is something that we should do. It is, I'm not overly optimistic that there's no shortage of scientific advice. One of my guilty feelings is that I'm on the mailing list for all of the National Academy putting out publications. I say that would be really great for me to just take a few hours off this afternoon and read it from cover to cover, and that doesn't satisfy unitarity of my time. And so this is it's just another example of the problem. I think the best that we can hope for is to try to have embedded in the staff of all politicians senior trusted scientific advisors with real technical understanding, with the time to have real technical understanding of these things. And I think it's important that they be embedded in individual offices, because as a politician, you depend on, when you get some advice, there's a problem that everyone that comes into your office, they're asking you for something and they're telling you their version of the truth, and you just get used to it and you are highly skeptical. But if you have in your office a scientific advisor who you've come to trust, and they know you and know what your incentives are and what you're trying to accomplish, but they can be your bridge, then that could be one of the most successful models for this. The difficulty, of course, is salaries, because if you say, okay, I can go work for an AI firm, or I can advise a member of Congress for 1/20th of the salary, it it doesn't work very long if you're, especially when you try raising a family around the Washington D.C. area.
So I see our time is coming to an end, getting the check here. But let me ask you, a final question is, just given your experience at Fermi, your time in Congress, your sense of where we are as a nation and globally, as you think about the prospect for science diplomacy in this particular hub that we're creating here at Johns Hopkins, what can we do? How can we be helpful in contributing to the agenda that you detailed here this morning in your remarks?
Yeah. Well, I think, first off, the first thing you can do is become very successful at this, because this is an all hands on deck thing, but there's also something remarkable. You see it about technology. And that is that you don't have to really understand all the way down the technology stack to make a useful contribution. For example, during my time in physics, I designed integrated circuits. I designed digital down converters and RF, basically RF receivers. I designed, programmed the entire software protocol for the internet protocol. So I pretty much understand everything that happens inside a cell phone, but that is absolutely no use in my ambitions to become a social media influencer. All right, and so it's remarkable.
How's that going?
What? No, they tell you just simplify it to death and do something cute. That's not, where there was science. In science, what you do is you describe, here is the problem at hand, here's the experiment we performed, here's the data, and here's our analysis. And that's hard to fit in a little TikTok video. But and it's a fundamental problem, and I am hopeful that everyone can contribute to this, simply because you actually don't need to see all the way down the technology stack to do this. Some of the most thoughtful people that I see in Congress on dealing with things like AI or science policy don't know the science very well, but they have a very good feeling for how the institutions that we have to create and interact with will evolve in response to this. And so there is a lot to be done. As a scientist, especially as a high-energy particle physicist, it's like the ultimate in reductionist thought, that unless you understand, the fundamental Lagrangian of the Standard Model, you're just not a serious human being. But that's actually not the case. You can be really useful as long as you can see you have an understanding of one or two layers down the technology stack that you operate at.
Terrific. Congressman, thank you so much for being here, for kicking us off today, and for your very thoughtful remarks. And also, of course, we thank you for your contributions to our country and being the advocate for science.
I'm trying.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great having you here.
Thank you so much, Congressman Foster, President Daniels. I would like to now welcome on stage Sybil Bjorklund, who's the Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center. Welcome.
Thank you, Ona. Good morning. I wanted to also say a quick thanks to Congressman Foster and President Daniels. They've given us all lots of food for thought to set the table for interesting conversations over the next 2 days. I'm Sybil Bjorklund. As Ona mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center, and I also serve as the head of our federal engagement for the University in Medicine. We're thrilled to welcome you here and to host the inaugural Science Diplomacy Summit in our new home in the heart of the nation's capital. We want to also acknowledge Dr. Peter Agre and PhD candidate. She is only a candidate and yet has done so much to organize the hub. Ona Ambrozaite. And forgive me if I've butchered your last name. It takes one to know one. For their enterprising and inspiring work to create this important and impressive summit. The Hopkins Bloomberg Center opened last fall with a mission to connect evidence-based research with policy development, to educate the next generation of civic leaders and innovators, and to convene a diversity of viewpoints to foster discovery and dialogue. Here on Pennsylvania Avenue, our goal is to bring people together across disciplines and differences in order to transform knowledge and ideas into impact through evidence-based policymaking. At the Bloomberg Center, we're bringing leading researchers and faculty from all corners of the university and the world to offer their objective expertise to policymakers in city halls, state capitals, Washington, and beyond. In many ways, the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub exemplifies this model. By building bridges between scientists of all stripes and representatives of key countries and organizations, the Hub showcases the mission and vision of our work here, which is to bring the outside in and the inside out. This week's summit convenes scholars, diplomats, policymakers, and practitioners from a wide range of disciplines and countries to address the global challenges on a handful of key tracks. While this conference provides an important opportunity to share ideas and solutions, it will also help strengthen and build an international network of science diplomats to support long-term partnerships. In fact, as Ona noted, summit attendees are here from more than 20 countries and dozens of organizations. We hope the next 2 days spark creative collaboration and generate fresh, actionable ideas that address the pressing problems of today and tomorrow. By serving as a platform for continued and expanded partnerships between the academic community, the public sector, and the private sector, the Hopkins Bloomberg Center is organized to help leading minds advance the public good here in the US, but also throughout the world, and perhaps, given that space is on the agenda, beyond. So thank you for joining us here today. I think we've got some reactors to the panel. Claire, if you're coming next, or Franklin. We really appreciate your attendance and engagement.
Thank you very much. Franklin, would you like a microphone or become a social media influencer?
I have no aspiration to become a social media influencer. In fact, I don't have social media. So my first task today here with my colleague Claire is to invite you all and welcome you again to our meeting. Thank you for being here. It's been a journey working with our colleagues Peter, Ona, and many of you that are here organizing some of the discussions today.
And we are honored to have all of you who are science diplomacy practitioners here in the room with us to celebrate the launch of Summit. And in the next day or so, we're going to go through actually quantum leap into an ocean and the space of science diplomacy and policy making. So we welcome you to explore all the topics with us. Now, let me tell you why NCURA, I represent National Council University Research Administrators, why NCURA is committed to support this summit and any future events related to Science Diplomacy Hub at Johns Hopkins University. NCURA aims to support a community, and we want to build a community of passionate, committed global leaders in supporting global collaboration. And we also want to offer equal opportunity and access of knowledge to those who are researchers, research administrators, research managers, no matter where they are. In fact, we just came back from Tbilisi, Georgia last month from a university capacity building workshop together with National Academy of Sciences.
And I represent the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. That organization was started over 150 years ago by an act of Congress and signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. We act as advisors to the nations on issues of science, engineering, and medicine. This is one of the main reasons why we're here. As Claire just mentioned, we will work across the world to make sure that we bring our knowledge, expertise in the science policy space together to inform a better world with better science policies.
And our second task here is to ensure you have all the information, access to all the information and the part discussion for the next 2 days. So if you have any question, you don't know where session is, the room is, please look, ask Franklin or Ona, so you can find either of us and the very helpful volunteers at the registration desk and all the helpful leadership and help from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center. Now, the most important thing, lunch break. It's in room 824. Remember this 3 number, 824 for lunch break. And coffee is outside. We are standing between you and the coffee, I know. 10:30, coffee will be right outside this auditorium. Chocolate and champagne break tomorrow is also outside this auditorium. These are the most important thing these 2 days. Remember that. And I have to thank our friends at the German embassy in Washington, D.C. by sponsoring the yummy gummy bears from Bonn, Germany, and also the science office from Embassy of Finland by providing part of the chocolate for chocolate and champagne break. Thank you very much.
So after coffee, we will have parallel pub discussions starting at 11. Room 820 will host the climate change discussion. Room 822 will host space and oceans. And here in the auditorium, we'll have international partnerships. Some of you have asked for a printed agenda. We're doing this for sustainability reasons. We want to be good stewards to our planetary resources. So thank you for your understanding. And again, if you need any directions or guidance, do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. Tomorrow morning, we will start at 9:50 a.m. with a plenary panel discussion touching upon the theme of this summit, Science Diplomacy in Action, and that will be followed by additional pod discussions. Tomorrow we will share where those will take place.
And then lunch break again, 8:25. Remember, all the lunch breaks at 8:25. 8:24. 8:24. Sorry.
Already changed the room.
And after that, we'll have 3 additional pod discussion in the afternoon, including a second international partnership part. And if you're not sure where to find room, feel free to stop by outside this room. There's a QR code to scan. And for those who do not have a cell phone with you, feel free to come to any of us. We will direct you.
So with that, we would like you to welcome you to attend.
Wait, Franklin, there's homework.
Homework.
If we don't have homework, there's no chocolate and champagne.
Okay, so yes, I forgot that there would be a post-summit survey. We ask you to share your thoughts about the summit. We're already thinking about next year's summit. If you are in an organization that would like to contribute to the discussion, please provide that feedback there. If there are additional topics, themes, ideas, suggestions, we welcome all of them. So please do take the opportunity to fill the survey.
And now we will officially go into a coffee break. Just before that, 2 more things. One is stay tomorrow for the reception. It's a science and art reception with a very surprise features. I won't spoil it. You have to stay to find out. Lastly, I want everyone here to keep this quote in mind when we go into the sessions today and tomorrow. If we do not become an active part of the policy making that impact us and affect our life, then that policy will be made without our reason, our wisdom, and our interest. And that is a quote from the first female director of National Science Foundation, Dr. Rita Colwell. And we also have WISTA, Women in Science Diplomacy Association leadership here to continue support women in science and women in science diplomacy. With that, please enjoy the coffee outside. Thank you very much for coming.
I stand corrected, as often happens in the science diplomacy space. The AI discussion will take place here in this auditorium. My apologies for misstating that previously.